Hi everybody, my name's Josie Cuff. I'm a tutor with the Learning Institute. One of the degrees that I teach on is inclusive education, and this is my colleague.
Hello, I'm Louise Bennett. I also teach with Josie on inclusive education and specifically on a module called Enabling Environments.
And today we are having a cup of coffee. And is it coffee or tea have you got, Louise? I've got coffee. And Louise has got tea. I'm sitting in my house in Devon. Louise is
I'm in France actually.
In France. So we're meeting virtually. We're talking about a subject that's really close to both of our hearts, and it's actually a subject that we talk about a lot on the inclusive education degree. We'll talk just for a few minutes about this, and it's participation and child and young people's voice. So how do we make sure that we listen to children and young people, and what do we do with what they tell us? What are the challenges as well of doing it? So Louise, just what do you think? What do you think we mean when we talk about participation? What does it mean?
Well, I think that the fundamental principle behind this is that young people, students, whatever age, whatever sector we work in, are they're the reason that we are where we are, and the reason every adult is within that environment. So if we don't listen to what they have to say, we're missing out on a huge part of understanding how their experience is, how their experience could be improved. And I think fundamentally that's why the child's voice and why participation is so critical when we work with young people.
And it's really difficult, isn't it, in practice with all the pressure. So, you know, both of us have worked in education. Our background is in secondary, so we understand the external pressures that are on a school to perform in certain ways, and it's really easy to forget really what is at the heart of our practice, which is the children and young people, and to forget that voice. But you're right, I mean, if we don't listen, we miss such a trick, because how do we know that what we're doing is what's working, really? So there are challenges as well, aren't there? I mean, you know, when you talk to teachers and staff about listening to children and young people, what kind of things do you hear back sometimes, you know?
Yeah, I think it can be seen as quite threatening, and it has to be. So my sort of experience in terms of doing this in practice, and you know, there's a lot of theory that underpins why this is so important, which we obviously talk about on our degrees. Some of that relates to this concept of heart ladder of participation, where it talks about how we might begin that process by just a little bit of feedback in a very controlled way. But one of the things that we did in the setting that I worked in, the secondary setting, was we thought it was really critical that anybody who was going to be working within the school, that some students had a really important part in their recruitment. So we had what was called a student interview panel, and I actually myself was interviewed for my job.
Yeah, I've been too. It's terrifying.
Yes, they were really discerning, and you know, it's quite a long process in terms of training them, making sure that they understood about, you know, the importance of confidentiality and what an important role this was. But what they did was, you know, with any role within the school, was they would put together some questions that were relevant to that post.
So did they? Sorry to interrupt you, but did they think of the questions themselves, or did we? Yeah. Okay, so that's really important, isn't it? That it's not led by the adult.
Yes, and they would know what the role was, so they would try and obviously tailor them. So if it were a teacher of PE, for example, they would be really interested in things like, well, what do you bring in terms of extracurricular? Yeah. What's your thing? What's your sport? Yeah. What are you going to be doing on a Tuesday night after we finish school? Because that was really important to them. Yeah. And they would interview And then they would feed back to the interview panel, the adult interview panel, and they would talk about, their perceptions of each candidate, how well they felt that candidates would fit into the setting, how they felt, maybe had they got the experience or had they got the enthusiasm. And it was really, really interesting to get their feedback. And I think anyone who underestimated their importance in the process found out, at their peril that they'd underestimated.
And we were talking about this before we started recording, weren't we? I mean, I have had that experience when I went for an interview at a school that I used to work at anyway, and I walked into the room with 3 student interviewees thinking, well, this is the easy part of the day, because I had this big panel interview in the afternoon and I had to teach a lesson in the morning. It was all full on. This was my downtime, and I walked out of there thinking, oh my Lord, I got asked the most difficult questions, but the most relevant questions, actually the questions that really, really mattered. Like you said, well, how are you going to, what extracurricular, what are you going to do for me? Yes. How are you going to make my experience better?
And I think that's so important to actually understand that what you're doing by asking students, by asking children to participate. I mean, these students were sort of 14, 15 years old, they're older, but even with young children, there are ways in which they can feed back. And I think we talk about different lenses of how we look at things. We talk about that quite a lot on different modules of the degree. And if you're missing that entire lens that is the students, there are far more of them in any environment. And actually it's so important to capture their views and their feedback. And whilst we didn't always agree, often we did actually. And it's interesting how their perception often aligned with the adult interview panel, but also how they would bring things that we hadn't considered, which is so important. And them understanding that it wasn't just a bit of sort of add-on that was paying lip service to it, and it was actually a really important part of the feedback process and the decision.
And that is really important, because you think of a lot of school councils and other kind of structures within a school setting that are supposed to be there to encourage the student voice, and often I think the feedback from those students is that it is just paying lip service to it, because whatever they say, it doesn't actually, nothing seems to be followed through. But then we've got that difficult issue of actually, well, we can't act on everything that children and young people tell us, because then we're assuming they all agree on stuff, and they don't. And apart from all the other things that a setting has to consider. So that's another question, isn't it? How do we keep, like, in your experience with that interview process, how did they react if the person that they wanted to put forward wasn't the person that got the role?
I think what we worked out quite quickly was that as long as there was provision within the day for them to have that time to feed back, and that their views were considered, actually the outcome was not actually that important. As they knew they'd been heard. And I might go back to them and say, well, actually, you understand that this is part of the process. One of the things that's really, really critical when we're looking for teachers, bearing in mind that this is probably the first and last time they will be interviewed, is that actually the lesson is really, really positive. So, having taken that aspect of learning and how students engage with that, we actually felt that this candidate was stronger in terms of their planning and their delivery and their relationships with students in a lesson, and therefore, so as long as you can justify and explain why it is that your decision has been made in the way it has, I think that's all that matters.
actually getting that feedback, because in other schools possibly where students are involved in an interview process, they might not ever really have any feedback after their input. And actually what you're saying is, if you do feedback to them honestly and they see logically why a decision was made, they're more than happy to accept it. I mean, I don't think we might, some parents might think differently, but actually children and young people are quite sensible often. And if they can see, no, actually what I want didn't happen, but I understand why it didn't happen, there's no problem. It's when they feel that actually they expressed what they wanted, it didn't happen, and they don't know why. That becomes, and
then it's just tokenistic.
Then they quickly lose interest in the process, and the next time you ask them to be involved, they might not want to. So it sounds like a really, really positive example of really good practice. It did work really well. What's your experience then, Josie? What have you seen? So I various different sort of roles within that would be relevant, but I suppose the key one is, one of the things I do is I'm a careers advisor in schools as well. So we work quite closely with children and young people with special educational needs and on their transition planning. So they're moving from year 11 onwards, normally that age group. And so we're looking at their the support plan that might be in place for them in their school, and how can that be carried forward to wherever they go next. And at the centre of that process, according to the government guidance, is the child and young person. So they are right at the centre, and that means that their views and their wishes need to be taken into account. And in practice, working in lots of different settings, you see examples of really great practice and then examples of practice that does fall short, really. And I don't think it's through any desire for it not to work, but it's just perhaps assuming that, for example, a child or young person who hasn't got speech, it means that they don't have a voice. So I think my particular interest is in how do we encourage participation for those children and young people for who they might find it difficult, but we find it difficult actually to find a way of so it's actually thinking about it, it's more our problem than theirs. And again, in on inclusive education, this is what we talk about a lot, actually. Whose problem is it? Disability. Whose problem actually is it? Is it a problem at all? But I think for say a child with no speech, actually there are loads of ways of they communicate, and it's about us tapping into the ways that they communicate. So I would argue that every child or young person has a voice, and even very, very young children as well. There are ways, as you alluded to, that you can encourage that participation, regardless of their age. You just adapt the techniques.
Yeah, and I think that's something we talk about a lot as well, isn't it? How we remove barriers. How we understand what the barriers are, around maybe a specific need, and how we remove that barrier to ensure that everyone has their voice heard. Because if a young person doesn't feel that they're important or their views have been heard, how can we expect them to engage in provision, which is ultimately about them? It's not
Now, I don't know what happened there, Louise. I lost your sound a little bit. So when this is, if anybody listening to this, you might have to lip read a bit, because you might not be able to hear what Louise is saying. Anyway, we probably should. Do you think we probably talked enough, haven't we?
I think so. Yeah.
It's been so interesting.
This is just one of the things we talk about as part of our degrees, and particularly the inclusive education degree. So if you are interested and you think this is something that you will be interested in discussing, take a look at the Learning Institute website.